By the time Elizabeth Larsen reached the stables, rainwater was streaming from her dark hair in narrow runnels, and blood had soaked through the fingers of her left glove. She did not know, until she tried to unlace it, whether the blood was hers or the horse's. The mare had thrown a shoe crossing the lower lane and sliced herself badly on flint, and Elizabeth had spent the last half-hour bracing one trembling shoulder against wet muscle, tying a torn apron into a bandage while lightning stitched the sky white over Hampshire fields. She had scarcely stepped beneath the stable eaves before Lady Larsen's voice cut through the rain. "Plain, slow, and ungrateful," her stepmother declared, each word crisp enough to carry to the grooms, the dairymaid, and old Martin at the tack bench. "A Larsen by charity, and this is how she repays a household's indulgence." Elizabeth stood very still while the laughter, quick, nervous, never quite, unkind but still laughter, flickered and went out among the servants. Lady Larsen wore pearl-grey silk despite the weather, as if storms politely arranged themselves around her conveniences. Her ringed hand fluttered once toward Elizabeth's mud-splashed hem with theatrical despair. "At 22 expects usefulness, if not beauty," she said, "yet we are denied both." The words should have stung less by now. They did not. Elizabeth lowered her eyes, not in surrender but in economy. If she looked up, she might answer, and an answer would cost more than silence ever did. She handed Martin the mare's reins and asked quietly for warm mash and clean cloths. Then she turned to go inside before her shaking became visible. Inside Larsen House she resumed the evening's order as if nothing had happened. She mended 3 pillowcases in the small workroom where the lamps smoked. She copied 2 pages of household accounts in a precise hand learned years earlier at her father's elbow. She fetched tea for callers who did not thank her, and carried away plates left with the careless entitlement of those born to be served by someone. Her stepmother's world treated humiliation like silver polishing, regular maintenance, best done without complaint. This had been her life for 4 years, since her father's death and Lady Larsen's rapid conversion from tearful widow to mistress of every key, ledger and decision in the house. Once, rooms had held music. Mr. Larsen had read Virgil aloud badly and with joy, corrected Elizabeth's arithmetic at breakfast, and insisted his daughter understand contracts before curtsies. "Feelings are expensive," he had told her once, tapping a column of figures. "Ignorance costs more." Now she was useful hands and an inconvenient name attached to a small, much-discussed portion that seemed always, by some mystery, not available. Suitors were not sought for her happiness. They were surveyed like purchasers at market. People in the parish said she was too thin to be pretty, her jaw too clear, her eyes too large and solemn for fashion. In candlelight, though, her profile took on a sharp grace, inked and miniature fine, and there was in her stillness the taut discipline of someone enduring by choice, not weakness. She had learned where to place her tears, never where witnesses stood, never where pity might be mistaken for permission. At dusk Lady Larsen summoned her to the blue drawing-room, where the wallpaper's faded swans sailed eternally toward nowhere. "You will take this at once to Mr. Hallam on the coaching road," Lady Larsen said, sealing a letter with hard pressure. "His patience is exhausted, and if the account is not discussed tonight, he may become litigious." Elizabeth accepted the letter. "It is near storm dark, madam." "Then walk quickly. You are, as we observe, built for weather." A gentleman lounging by the fire, one of the men who had lately begun visiting too often and staying too long over port, smirked into his glass. Elizabeth curtsied because custom required it, and because refusal would only produce another scene she had no strength to perform in. By the time she reached the lane beyond the beech copse, the storm had broken in earnest. Rain came not in drops but in sheets, flattening hedges, blurring milestones, turning the road to black rivered mud. Wind pushed at her like a living thing. She tucked Lady Larson's letter inside her bodice to keep the seal dry and bent her head into the gale. Thunder rolled over the downs, deep and immediate. Then, between one crack of sky and the next, she heard something else. A horse screaming. The sound came from the shallow ditch where the road curved toward the old quarry track. A curricle lay half overturned, one wheel splintered, shaft snapped clean through. One horse had torn free and vanished. The other kicked wildly in tangled harness, foam and rain streaking its flanks. A groom, blood on his temple, crawled on hands and knees in the mud, trying and failing to rise. "My God!" Elizabeth breathed, already moving. She knelt beside the man. "Can you stand? The boy!" he gasped. Under there!" A small cry answered him, thin with panic. Elizabeth dropped to her knees in the ditch. Beneath fractured oak and soaked leather, she saw a child's hand, white against mud. The curricle shifted when she pulled at the frame, pinning her wrist. Pain shot up her arm. She ignored it and braced both feet, hauling again. The wood gave enough for her to wedge her shoulder under a broken rail. "Little sir," she called over the rain, forcing steadiness into her voice. "I am here. Do not struggle. Breathe for me. Good, like that." Lightning flared, showing a boy of perhaps 6, face streaked with dirt and tears, one leg trapped by wreckage. She pushed splintered timber aside, then tore her already ruined glove to bind a cut on his forehead before blood could run into his eyes. When the final length of shaft shifted free, she dragged him clear and wrapped him in her cloak, though it was soaked through. The groom tried to speak again and collapsed. No carriage was coming. No lantern showed on the road. The nearest posting inn stood nearly half a mile back toward the turnpike. Elizabeth knew because she had walked this road in all seasons, bearing letters she was never told to read. She lifted the child. He was heavier than he looked, rigid with shock, then shivering as cold set in. "Where's Papa?" he whispered against her shoulder. "Coming," she said, "but we go first." She did not remember all of the walk afterward. Only fragments, mud sucking at her boots, her breath burning, the boy's small fingers twisted in her collar, thunder so loud it seemed to split her ribs. Twice she slipped and nearly fell. Once she went to one knee in the roadway and stayed there a heartbeat too long, fighting the dark at the edge of her vision. Then she stood and kept moving. The inn lamp appeared at last as a blurred gold square through rain. She struck the door with her fist hard enough to bruise. The innkeeper opened to a storm, and a woman caked in mud, clutching a child like smuggled treasure. "Hot bricks," Elizabeth said before he could speak. "Dry blankets. Send for a surgeon. There is a groom on the lower road and one horse still harnessed." She put the boy into the innkeeper's arms only when she saw someone else already running for stairs and towels. Then the room tilted. She caught herself on the table edge, breathing shallowly, and left a smear of blood and rainwater across the polished wood. Time fractured into noise and firelight. Boots thudded in the yard. Men's voices rose, urgent, then hushed. A physician arrived with a leather case and went straight upstairs. Someone pressed warmed wine to Elizabeth's lips. She swallowed without tasting it. The door banged open again sometime near midnight, and cold air swept through the taproom. A tall man entered, drenched to the bone, greatcoat black with rain. He removed his gloves with movements too controlled for panic, though panic blazed just beneath. His face was narrow, severe. His mouth seemed carved for command rather than conversation. "Where is he?" he demanded. The innkeeper pointed upward. "Alive, my lord, feverish but alive, thanks to—" His gaze followed the gesture and landed on Elizabeth, who was trying unsuccessfully to stand straight while her soaked skirt dripped onto the flagged floor. For one suspended second he said nothing. He simply looked at her with the hard composure of a man accustomed to being obeyed and unaccustomed to owing anyone. Then he crossed the room in 3 strides. "You carried my son through a storm. What do you want in return?" The question might have sounded generous from another mouth. From his it sounded almost like a challenge, as if debt itself offended him. Elizabeth's hands were still shaking. Her voice, when it came, was low and exact. "Your son's fever broken by morning, my lord. Anything else may wait." Something in his expression shifted, not softened exactly, but arrested. He gave a short nod and turned for the stairs, barking orders for more blankets, more coal, more light. Men moved. She remained where she was until the innkeeper's wife steered her into a chair and insisted on untying the mangled glove. The blood, it turned out, was mostly hers. By dawn, the storm had run itself ragged. The boy slept. The surgeon said the fever might break if the night held. The nobleman, Lord Ravenshield, people whispered now, as if title explained weather and fear, sent his physician back to inspect Elizabeth's torn hand and his own carriage to convey her home. If gratitude warmed him, it did so privately. His thanks were correct, his bow precise, his distance unmistakable. Lady Larson read significance into everything. When Elizabeth stepped from the Earl's carriage at Larson House, wrapped in borrowed wool and exhaustion, her stepmother met her in the hall with eyes bright as polished steel. "So," Lady Larson said sweetly, loud enough for 2 footmen and a maid to hear, "our modest Elizabeth has discovered dramatics, ditches and storms and noble children. One must admire ambition when one has no face for gentler methods." Elizabeth removed her damp bonnet with careful fingers. "A child was injured, madam, and rescued by exactly the right witness. Convenient." The next days tightened like a noose. Calls multiplied. Lady Larson spoke in coded half-sentences about opportunities, appearances, prudence. Then, without warning, she announced over breakfast that Mr. Pritchard would dine on Thursday. Elizabeth Spoon paused. "Why?" "Because," said Lady Larson, buttering toast, "Mr. Pritchard is a sensible widower of means, and because our accounts require settlement. He has indicated willingness to absorb certain burdens in exchange for a young wife." Elizabeth stared at her. "I have not consented." "You are a dependent daughter with no fortune in hand and a reputation suddenly lively from roadside adventures. Congal Fit, my dear, is often a luxury item." Mr. Pritchard arrived broad, perfumed, and 50 if a day, with damp lips and ring-heavy fingers that lingered too long when introduced. He spoke to Lady Larson about interest rates while looking at Elizabeth as if estimating the wear on a horse he intended to buy. Before soup, he called her a quiet little creature. Before dessert, he inquired whether she was obedient. That night, Elizabeth sat in her narrow room beneath the eaves and unfolded, for the 100th time, scraps of her father's old notes, columns, percentages, reminders in the margin to review trust language. She had knowledge. She had no legal standing to wield it alone. That was the trap. On Saturday, a sealed note arrived with the Ravenshield crest. The Earl requested a meeting through his steward to acknowledge obligations incurred. Lady Larson nearly trembled with triumph. "You will go," she ordered, "and be agreeable. We are not so foolish as to refuse aristocratic intervention." At Ravenshield House in London, the intervention proved less romantic than she had feared, and more complicated than she expected. Lord Ravenshield received her in a library severe enough to feel like a courtroom. He thanked her formally for saving his son and offered a substantial sum, payable immediately. Elizabeth looked at the figure. It was enough to excite greed in anyone who did not understand its fragility. "I cannot keep this, my lord," she said. His brows drew together. "Most would not decline. Most are not under another woman's legal control. If I return with money, it becomes hers by supper. By next week I am married to a creditor. Your generosity would have financed my own sale." Silence followed. He studied her as if reassessing a map. "What do you ask, then?" She had rehearsed the words all night. "A respectable post. Temporary. Your son knows me, and he is recovering from shock. Let me serve as his governess until he is well enough for regular arrangements, wages paid quarterly into an account in my own name, if legally possible." "A governess," he repeated, as if testing the shape of it. "Yes, my lord, work, not charity." By the window, rain tapped faintly on glass. Nothing like the storm that had changed everything and nothing. Ravenshield's expression gave little away, but when he spoke it was without mockery. "Very well, temporarily." Outside those walls, gossip ignited instantly. The plain dependent who had hauled an earl's son from wreckage now installed under his roof. Inside, the stakes were simpler and sharper. If she failed, she would be sent back. If she returned, Lady Larson would have bans posted before breakfast, and Mr. Pritchard in the pew by Sunday. Elizabeth signed the employment papers with a steady hand. She read each clause before she touched ink to parchment, hearing her father's voice in every line. Then she lifted her chin and gave the document back. For the first time in years, fear and hope weighed exactly the same. Fear and hope weighed the same for perhaps 3 breaths. Then Mr. Fenwick, Lord Ravenshield's steward, took back the signed papers, sanded the ink, and said, "If you please, Miss Larson, Mrs. Grant will show you to the nursery floor. His lordship desires that his son not be disturbed by formal introductions tonight." The sentence was courteous, but it carried both warning and trust. "You are admitted. Do not presume." Elizabeth inclined her head. "Of course." Ravenshield House moved around her with the hush of expensive habit, carpets deep enough to quiet footfall, polished banisters, portraits whose painted eyes had never once worried about coal bills. The housekeeper, Mrs. Grant, was a capable woman with silvering hair and a face arranged into professional neutrality. "This way, miss. We keep the schoolroom at the back for morning light. Master is wakeful after dark, less so by day." She paused at a door. "You may find him altered after the accident. I should be surprised if he were not." That answer earned Elizabeth the first flicker of approval she had seen in the woman's expression. Inside, the nursery fire burned low. Blocks, toy soldiers, and 2 wooden horses stood abandoned on the rug, as if play had been interrupted by weather and never resumed. The child sat propped in bed, curls damp at his temples, face still too pale beneath healing cuts. His eyes found Elizabeth at once. "You came," he said, with the solemn astonishment of a person who had expected to be left. "I said I would." He watched as she removed her gloves with her good hand and laid them neatly on a side table. The torn one had been replaced. Stitches pulled at her palm when she flexed her fingers. "Is it raining?" "Not tonight." He seemed to consider this as one might consider a suspicious treaty. "Will it?" "Certainly. England cannot be relied upon for restraint." A tiny, unwilling smile touched his mouth. Mrs. Grant withdrew, closing the door softly. That first week was measured in small salvations. He ate half a slice of bread without retching. He slept 3 hours without waking, shouting for the horse that had screamed in the ditch. He permitted the physician to examine his leg, if Elizabeth stood where he could see her. When thunder muttered over London one afternoon, he froze and began to shake. She sat on the floor beside him and told him, in very bad Latin and better translation, how Aeneas crossed a storm, not because the sea was kind, but because he kept steering. "You may be afraid," she said quietly, when the room had stopped spinning for him, "and still be brave. They are not opposites." He absorbed this with grave attention, then asked whether Trojan boys also hated tonics. "Passionately," Elizabeth said. "It is one of history's least discussed truths." By the 10th day he was laughing in brief startled bursts, as if laughter itself might betray him. By the 12th he began to test her boundaries with the tactical intelligence of all recovering children. Refusal to copy letters, refusal to wash, refusal to nap, refusal because refusal existed. She met each campaign with calm consistency. No raised voice, no bargaining where instruction was required, no humiliation when obedience took time. In that, she discovered, trust and discipline were cousins. Lord Ravenshield remained an intermittent presence, always exact, never warm. He appeared in the schoolroom doorway without sound, observed a lesson, asked his son 2 precise questions, then left before conversation could blur into intimacy. Yet there were changes minute as pinpricks. One evening, finding his son asleep over an illustrated Plutarch, he lifted the boy himself rather than summoning a servant. Another morning he asked Elizabeth whether the child still startled at carriage wheels. The question was practical. The concern beneath it was not. "They are less frightening when announced," she said. "Sudden noise is the difficulty." He nodded. "I will have the courtyard gates oiled. No flourish, no praise, action." Her wages were entered exactly as contracted. Fenwick arranged at her request for deposit into an account under her sole signature through a discreet banking house. The first receipt, small though it was, made Elizabeth's throat tighten unexpectedly. Coin she earned, coin she could keep. It felt less like money than proof of personhood. Then Lady Larson's letters began arriving with clockwork regularity. The first was silkily affectionate. "My dear child, your theatrical absence has been indulged long enough. Return home at once, and let us make sensible plans for your future." The second was drier. Mr. Pritchard remains generously disposed, though no gentleman appreciates delay. The third dispensed with euphemism. "You are not independent, whatever nonsense aristocratic households may encourage. Come back before you oblige me to enforce obedience." Elizabeth read each one in her narrow room off the school corridor, folded it once and placed it in a locked workbox beneath her father's notes. She did not reply. Any answer could be rewritten against her. By the end of the second fortnight, gossip had found architecture. A cousin of a footman's wife had seen her carriage at Ravenshield House. A lady at church had remarked on her rapid promotion. Someone in Hampshire had coined the phrase storm bride and sent it north wrapped in malice. Mrs. Grant, who had managed households through scandals more interesting than this, said only, "People must feed on something, miss. Better rumour than raw liver." One morning a parcel arrived without card. Violet ribbon, lace cap, and a bottle of scent too sweet to bear. The shop mark was from Bond Street. The enclosed bill was made out to Mr. Pritchard. Elizabeth handed the box to Mrs. Grant, unopened, after identifying the hand. "I cannot keep these." "I should think not," said the housekeeper grimly. "I'll have it returned by messenger and receipt copied." That evening Lord Ravenshield asked, without preamble, "Have you been importuned?" The directness startled her less than the fact that he had noticed. "Yes, my lord." "Do you wish me to intervene?" She chose her answer carefully. "I wish to remain employed under the terms agreed. If you intervene as master of this house, I am protected while I am useful. If you intervene as a nobleman in a lady's family dispute, I become a story. Stories are easily bent. A pause. You do not trust protection. I trust contracts. For a moment she thought she had offended him. Then his mouth moved, barely, at one corner. Not quite a smile. Something like recognition. Very well, Miss Larson, then we shall keep to contracts. Trouble did not keep to contracts. It arrived on a clear afternoon when the child was practising copywork by the nursery window, and Elizabeth was correcting a line of crooked G's. The nursery maid tapped and entered pale. "Beg pardon, miss. There's a lady below, insists on seeing you, says she is family." Elizabeth's pen stilled. "Did she give a name?" "Lady Larson, miss, and a gentleman with her." "Of course." "Tell Mrs. Grant I will receive them in the morning room, not here." The maid hesitated. "They are already on the nursery stair." Before Elizabeth could move, voices sounded in the passage. Lady Larson's bright, penetrating tones, followed by Pritchard's breathy chuckle. The door opened without ceremony. Lady Larson swept in, dressed for triumph in peacock blue. Mr. Pritchard close behind, like expensive mildew. Both stopped when they saw the child at the table. Lady Larson's eyes narrowed, calculating audience and leverage in the same glance. "My poor dear!" she cried, extending both hands toward Elizabeth with performance-ready sorrow. "What a little exile they have made of you." Elizabeth did not take the hands. "You should not have come up without permission," Mr. Pritchard sniffed. "You forget yourself." "No," she said. "I remember myself precisely." The boy had gone very still, pencil suspended. He looked from one adult to another, sensing danger without understanding its vocabulary. Lady Larson shifted tactics instantly. "You see, sir," she addressed the child as if he were a magistrate, "your governess has always had a dramatic temperament. Her poor father indulged it shamelessly. A weak man, for all his pretensions to scholarship. He could no more manage accounts than manage his own household, and left us all in debt from his foolishness." The room snapped into silence. Elizabeth felt not heat, but clarity, cold and bright as winter glass. She stepped between Lady Larson and the table. "My father taught me numbers, madam, enough to count every lie you have told in his name." Pritchard flushed mottled red. "Insolent girl!" The door opened again. Lord Ravenshield stood on the threshold, coat still on from riding, gloves in one hand. His gaze moved from Elizabeth's face to Lady Larson's to the frightened child and settled at last on Pritchard, with a chill so complete it seemed to lower the temperature of the room. "You are in my nursery," he said, "uninvited." Lady Larson recovered first, dipping into a curtsy that was almost parody. "My lord, a family misunderstanding. We came only to retrieve my stepdaughter from her employment." His tone remained level. "Miss Larson is retained here by contract." Pritchard attempted geniality and failed. "Surely, my lord, a woman's natural guardians are irrelevant in my nursery." Ravenshield turned his head slightly. "Fenwick." The steward appeared, as if summoned by spell. "Show Lady Larson and Mr. Pritchard out," said the Earl. "If they return without invitation, they are not to pass the front hall." Lady Larson's smile sharpened into something venomous. "You may shelter her for now, my lord, but debts do not dissolve because a girl climbs stairs above her station." She swept out. Pritchard followed with a muttered threat and one backward look at Elizabeth that made her skin crawl. When the corridor quieted, the boy began to cry soundlessly, shoulders shaking. Elizabeth knelt beside him and held him until the tremors passed, murmuring nonsense about blotting paper and treacherous letter forms. Over his bowed head she felt Lord Ravenshield still standing there, witness to everything she had not wanted witnessed. Later, when the child slept, Ravenshield asked from the schoolroom hearth, "Was any of what she said true?" Elizabeth kept her eyes on the copybook she was stacking. "About my father, no. About debt?" She stopped. "I do not know the whole truth," she said at last. "I know only that the figures never matched. Whenever I asked, the books were removed." He studied her for a long moment. "Fenwick has old account bundles to sort for quarter day. The clerk is ill. If you're willing, he could use exact eyes." She met his gaze. "I am willing." Fenwick's office smelled of sealing wax, leather and dust, old enough to remember different governments. Ledgers stood in ranked rows like sober jurymen. Elizabeth sat at the side table with sleeves pinned back, sorting receipts by year while rain whispered against the high panes. "Ravenshield has holdings in 3 counties, Fenwick said, handing her another stack. "You needn't untangle every historical absurdity, only mark duplicates and irregular entries. I was raised on irregular entries." He gave her an assessing look, then nodded once, as if another private calculation had resolved. Most of it was routine: tenant rents, coal contracts, repairs, legal fees. Then, near the bottom of a tied packet, mislabelled Hampshire Miscellaneous, she found her father's name. She froze. Not Larson House, she told herself. Common surname, could be another. But the next line gave the parish. The next, the solicitor. Hale and Brimley, Winchester, her father's firm. Her pulse began to pound behind her eyes. "Mr. Fenwick," she said quietly, "may I examine this bundle in full?" He glanced over. "If it concerns your own family, yes. Make notes, do not remove originals." It was all there, and worse than she had feared. Copies of settlement drafts, annuity schedules, promissory notes purportedly signed on Lady Larson's authority after her husband's death. And threaded through them, unmistakable, were additions in her stepmother's hand, figures altered upward, interest recalculated at predatory rates, debts listed twice under different headings. One memorandum claimed emergency borrowing against Elizabeth's portion for medical expenses and roof repairs in a year when no such repairs had been made, and no physician called except for a maid's chilblains. Another tied payments directly to Pritchard 2 months before he had ever been publicly introduced to the family. Fabricated burden, manufactured urgency, coerced marriage as a settlement. She copied columns until her fingers cramped, marking each discrepancy with ruthless neatness. At intervals she had to stop and breathe through a wave of nausea that was almost relief. She had not imagined it. She had been deceived, not incompetent. By late afternoon, her notes filled 12 pages. She requested certified copies through Fenwick's clerk and sealed them in a packet. Then, carrying the originals in both hands like fragile evidence in a murder trial, she asked to see Lord Ravenshield. He was in the library where she had first declined his money. Firelight struck red through brandy in untouched glass. He looked up as she entered, took in her face, and stood. "What is it?" She set the ledger open on the desk between them. "Proof," she said, "or as close as paper gives us before court." He read in silence, turning pages with growing stillness. Once he swore under his breath so softly she would have missed it if the room had not been otherwise silent. When he finished, he did not immediately speak. "You expected me not to believe you," he said at last. "I have been called hysterical for less specific claims. Not here." Something in her chest, tightly knotted for years, loosened by one thread. He rested a hand on the open page where her father's name appeared. "I should have said this sooner. I knew him." Elizabeth stared. "My father?" "In Spain, Peninsular Campaign." His jaw tightened, memory moving under skin like old scar tissue. "My unit was cut off near a flooded crossing. Your father was attached as civilian commissary. Wrong place, wrong hour. He rode back under fire with 2 pack mules and dragged me out after my horse went down. I was 19 and arrogant enough to think myself immortal. He disabused me. She had no immediate language for this. She could see her father laughing at breakfast, ink on his cuff, speaking of troop supply columns, as if they were puzzle games. She had never known he had once ridden into musket fire for a near stranger. "Why did you never say—" "Because gratitude can be another form of pressure," he said, "and you had enough of that from me already." The admission landed without ornament, and precisely because of that, it felt like truth. He straightened. "These documents are actionable. I can have my man of business proceed at once. Quietly, if you prefer." Quietly. Hidden settlement, sealed apologies, no public scandal. Safety purchased with silence. Elizabeth looked at the ledgers, at her own notes in the margin, at the way Lady Larson had used secrecy as weapon and shadow as law. "No," she said. Ravenshield's brows rose slightly. "She announced my obedience in public rooms. She intends to sell me in public, by rumour, if not by bans. Let the answer be public too." Her voice did not shake now. "Lady Harbury's music hall is next Thursday. Half Hampshire in London will attend, including men who witnessed my father's trust terms when he signed them. I will petition Hale and Brimley tomorrow morning, secure sworn copies, and speak before witnesses before she can announce another false engagement." "That will be ugly." "Yes. You may be attacked. I have been attacked for years, my lord. This time I intend to leave marks." For the first time since she had known him, Lord Ravenshield's reserve broke into something unmistakably like respect. "Very well," he said. "We proceed on your terms." Elizabeth gathered the papers, feeling the weight of them settle into purpose. She had endured because endurance was what survival required. Now survival was no longer enough. She would not be purchased, she would not be hidden. She would not return to a house where truth was rewritten by whichever hand held the key. Tomorrow she would go to the solicitor. Next week she would speak. Next week she would speak. The conviction held through the night, through the careful stacking of copied pages, through the moment she blew out her candle and lay awake listening to the house settle around her. By breakfast Lady Larson had moved first. A footman in Ravenshield livery brought in the Morning Post on a silver tray. Fenwick sorted it with his usual economy, then paused over one seal, frowned, and handed it to Elizabeth rather than to his master. "From Hampshire, miss. Marked urgent." The seal was broken already. Lady Larson never trusted wax where servants might pry and preferred to use thread. Inside, the note was brief and viciously neat. "You overestimate paper and underestimate consequence. Return before Thursday, and I may yet keep this from the courts. Persist, and I will expose your conduct in London and recover you by lawful means." Beneath it was a second folded sheet in Pritchard's hand, all flourishes and legal phrases copied from better men. Notice of his intention to pursue damages for breach of promise and reputational injury, naming Elizabeth and any parties who knowingly interfere with contracted domestic settlement. No promise had ever been made, no contract signed. None of that would matter if spoken often enough in rooms where she didn't stand. Fenwick read both pages over her shoulder with silent permission, then looked toward Lord Ravenshield at the head of the table. His lordship's face did not change, only his fingers tightened once on the handle of his cup. "Mr. Fenwick," he said, "send for Mr. Tolland." Their man of business, fast, discreet, expensive. Elizabeth folded the letters back to exact creases. "No," she said. Both men looked at her. "If you answer this with your solicitor before I petition mine, she will call it coercion by rank. She wants me to look like your instrument." "She also wants you frightened," Ravenshield said. "I am frightened." The admission hung between them, plain and unsentimental. She set the pages down. "I will still go to Hale and Brimley this morning." Ravenshield's jaw worked, as if over an argument he disliked. "You do not go alone." "I did not ask to—" "You do not go alone," he repeated, quieter now, less command than insistence edged with something she recognised as fear. "Take Mrs. Grant's carriage and one of my men, not to speak for you, to bring you back if this worsens." She met his gaze. "Very well." Hale and Brimley occupied 2 dark brick rooms off a narrower Winchester street than she remembered, as if grief and debt had shrunk the city in her absence. A brass plate, polished to excessive brightness, reflected rain clouds and passing wheels. Inside, the clerk at the outer desk glanced up, took in her name, and almost visibly flinched. "Miss Larson, we were not expecting you." "You should have been," she said. "I sent word last evening." He licked dry lips. "Mr. Hale is with a client." "I will wait." She did not sit. Rain tapped at the window, ink dried. Clerks moved in and out with bundles tied in red tape. 10 minutes stretched to 30. At 40, she asked again. At 50, Mr. Hale finally emerged, thinner than she remembered, whiskers gone grey, eyes refusing hers. "Miss Larson," he said, as if surprised by weather rather than appointment. "A delicate business." "Then let us handle it indelicately and with speed." She offered her packet. "I require certified copies of my father's trust instructions and all posthumous debt instruments entered by Lady Larson. Also a statement as to her authority to bind my portion." He did not take the packet. "My dear young lady," he began, and she knew, before he continued, that he would betray her with gentleness. "Certain documents are no longer in our immediate possession." The room seemed to tilt by half a degree. "Explain." "Your stepmother attended yesterday with Mr. Pritchard and a gentleman from Kettering and Vale. She requested transfer of relevant family instruments to their firm for consolidated management. As executorial widow, she was not within rights to remove my father's original trust schedule without my acknowledgement once I reached majority." Mr. Hale spread his hands in exhausted apology. "The point may be arguable. The papers are gone." "Then swear to what was in them." His eyes flicked toward the open office door where 2 clerks pretended not to listen. "Miss Larson, you must understand my position. I have acted for your household for years. I cannot enter sworn dispute on recollection alone, where originals are contested." "You can," she said. "You will not." A flush rose under his collar. "Language like that will not help you. Nor has politeness." From her satchel she drew the copied ledger pages from Fenwick's office and laid them on his desk one by one. Altered interest figures, duplicated debt lines, dates aligning with Pritchard's private receipts. Mr. Hale stared, his mouth compressed. "Where did you obtain these?" "From legitimate account bundles identifying your firm." "If these are circulated without chain of custody, opposing counsel will call them theft." "Then provide custody." He looked suddenly old. "I cannot. Not I dare not. Not I am prevented. Cannot." The coward's passive voice. By the time she stepped back into the street, the rain had begun in earnest. Ravenshield's groom moved to take her satchel, but she kept it, fingers rigid around the clasp. She had expected resistance. She had not expected this specific collapse. The man who had drafted her father's protections shrinking behind procedure while those protections were carried out the back door. Back at Ravenshield House, the second blow was waiting. Mrs. Grant intercepted her in the hall, expression grim. "His lordship is in the morning room. There has been correspondence." Ravenshield stood by the fireplace with 2 open letters in hand, and anger held so tightly it looked like stillness. "One from Lady Larson," he said, without preamble. "One from Pritchard's solicitor sent to my trustees and copied to the Board of Guardians for my son's estate." He handed them over. The language was ornate and poisonous. Improper familiarity between an unmarried governess and the Earl. Manipulation of a minor heir through emotional coercion following a staged rescue incident. Removal of the child from suitable maternal influences, a line underlined twice. For the boy's moral safety, Miss Larson should be immediately dismissed and returned to her family pending inquiry. Elizabeth read to the end and felt something cold settle at the base of her spine. If Lady Larson succeeded, Elizabeth lost everything at once. Wages, standing, legal foothold, and worst of all, the child who had learned to sleep because she promised storms ended. Sent back now, she would be married to Pritchard within a fortnight and silenced for life. Ravenshield watched her fold the letters very carefully. "My trustees cannot compel me in my own house," he said, "but they can force formal review if they claim risk to my son. They will do so to protect the title from scandal." "Then I am the risk." "You are the target," he corrected. He moved to the writing desk and drew out a document with his seal already impressed. "Until the review sits, I can shield you by changing your designation, not governess. Educational clerk to my steward, seconded to nursery instruction by my written order. It is dull enough to discourage gossip and lawful enough to survive it." She stared at him. Even now he was building structures between her and the fall. "That protects your household," she said quietly. "It also proves Lady Larson can strike whatever I build." "Yes." The honesty hurt more than reassurance would have. From upstairs came the faint thud of quick feet. The nursery door opened and closed. A child's laugh floated down the stairwell and vanished. Elizabeth pressed her thumb into the edge of the letter until it stung. "Thursday," she said. "If we fail Thursday, she takes me back in law or in ruin. There will be no second attempt." Ravenshield did not offer comfort. He offered agreement. "Then we do not fail." They failed the next morning anyway. Not wholly, not irreparably, but enough to leave bruises that did not fade by evening. Fenwick had arranged for one of her father's surviving witnesses, Captain Avery, to meet at chambers and swear that Mr. Larson's trust protected Elizabeth's portion from marital debt. They arrived to find the captain already gone, carriage tracks fresh in the mud. "He left a note," the clerk said, uncertain whether to be apologetic or afraid. "Regrets, sudden indisposition." The note, when produced, was in a hand too steady for illness, and signed with a blot that might have been deliberate disguise. "Unfit to involve myself in domestic quarrel. Must decline appearance in any public forum. Bribed, pressured, or threatened. Result identical." The second witness, Reverend March, received her at the vicarage door with eyes red-rimmed and wife hovering behind him. He did not invite her in. "Miss Larson, I am sorry," he said in a whisper. "I have daughters." It was not refusal of truth. It was surrender to fear of consequence. She could not even hate him properly for it. By afternoon, one by one, practical supports thinned. Kettering and Vale refused to release copied trust abstracts without Lady Larson's authorization. Hale sent a letter through messenger disclaiming certainty as to marginal annotations. A printer who had promised to prepare discreet legal circulars withdrew after receiving an unnamed warning that publishing slander against respected gentry might invite prosecution. When Elizabeth returned to Ravenshield House, Wetham clinging to her boots, Mrs. Grant met her with softened eyes. "He's had a difficult day, miss." The child sat in the schoolroom window seat with a toy horse upside down in his lap. He looked up when she entered and tried to smile. "Cook says I mustn't ask questions," he said. "Cook is wise in pastry and foolish in philosophy." He did not laugh. "Are you going away?" There it was, the wound stripped of politeness. She knelt so they were level. "I am fighting not to." His fingers tightened around the horse's wooden leg. "Papa sends men when things are bad." "Yes. Who do you send?" The question struck so deep she almost could not breathe for a moment. "Myself," she said, "because lies to children are always paid with interest. And sometimes people who choose to stand beside me." He leaned forward and put his forehead briefly against hers, an awkward, fierce gesture he had invented after nightmares. Then he pulled back and set the horse right side up with careful hands. After he slept, the doubt came in earnest. She sat at the narrow desk in her room, candles guttering low, failed notes spread before her like small bodies after battle. No witness, no original trust in hand. Opposing counsel already shaping narrative, ungrateful dependents seduced by rank, lashing out at respectable guardians. She had evidence, yes, but evidence without admissible chain and corroboration could be made to look like cunning forgery. She knew numbers. She was learning law by pain. For the first time since the storm rode, she let herself weep, quietly, angrily, one hand over her mouth so no sound escaped into the corridor. She wept for her father's absent signature, for every year spent calculating instead of living, for the child upstairs who might wake to find her gone because adults preferred tidy lies to untidy truth. A knock came, soft but deliberate. She wiped her face, failed to hide all trace, and opened the door. Ravenshield stood in shirt sleeves, cravat loosened, as if by inattention rather than comfort. He took one look at her and did not pretend not to understand. "I won't ask if you are well," he said. "You are not." "No." He held out a folded sheet. "Fenwick recovered this from old military correspondence in my dispatch chest. Your father wrote to me 6 months before his death regarding a loan I pressed upon him, and he refused. In refusing, he references the trust terms for your portion, explicitly, and in his own hand." She stared at the page without taking it. "This is not the original instrument," she said. "It may not be enough." "No, but it is sworn identifiable handwriting from my archive, predating all this by years." She accepted it with trembling fingers. The script was unmistakably her father's. Impatient loops, ink-dark emphasis, a marginal joke about teaching best to audit angels. Her vision blurred again, but now from something adjacent to strength. "Why didn't you tell me you had this?" "Because I did not know until tonight." He hesitated, then added quieter. "Because I had not looked in that chest since my wife died." The confession startled her more than if he had touched her. They stood in the doorway with too much unsaid between them, and no safe language to carry it. At last he inclined his head and stepped back. "Sleep if you can," he said. "Tomorrow we'll ask more." When he had gone, she closed the door and sat down with her father's letter under both palms, like a relic salvaged from fire. It was not victory. It was a thread, but threads could hold if tied correctly. That same night, long after the household lamps were lowered, Lord Ravenshield remained awake in the library with only banked coals and one candle burning down. On the desk before him lay 3 objects he rarely allowed in the same room: his son's first copied alphabet, jagged as fencing, his late wife's miniature in an ivory frame, and Mr. Larson's letter, now mirrored by the one he had just given Elizabeth. He had built his life on compartments: estate, title, child, grief, each locked, each labelled, each opened only as needed. It had kept him functional. It had also made him, in private, a man who mistook control for integrity. When the storm had delivered Elizabeth to the inn floor, mud-streaked and bleeding, his first emotion after terror was anger at debt. Not at her, at the fact of owing. Owing meant dependence, and dependence had nearly killed him twice. Once in Spain when a horse collapsed under him and musket fire stitched mud at his ears, and once in his own house when doctors with gentle voices failed to save his wife while he stood useless in the corridor, counting breaths that stopped anyway. He had not spoken his wife's name aloud in months. Tonight it came, rough as gravel. Anne! The miniature did not answer. It never did, and still he kept it. A soft knock interrupted before he could despise himself for sentiment. His sister entered without waiting, widowed Lady Beatrice, the only person alive who ignored his rank with consistency. "You're frightening the staff," she said, dropping into a chair. "Fenwick says you've rewritten half the nursery's legal framework and glared at a bishop." "I did not glare at a bishop." "You glowered in liturgical rhythm." He almost smiled, then did not. Beatrice's gaze moved to the objects on the desk, sharpened, softened. "Ah," she said, "one of those nights." He rubbed a hand over his face. "I am about to drag a young woman through public scandal to correct a wrong my class would rather ignore. I cannot tell whether this is honour or selfishness. Both, probably. Most consequential acts are." He looked at her, tired enough to be honest. "If this breaks badly, they will say I compromised her for sport. If I distance myself, she stands alone and may be destroyed. If I move too forcefully, I prove her enemies right about power. There is no clean position." "Since when have you required clean?" Beatrice leaned forward. "You require certainty, different vice." Silence stretched. At last he said, "When Anne died, I promised I would never again let private feeling alter public judgment." Beatrice did not flinch. "And how has that gone?" "Perfectly. You've become admired, solvent, and half dead." The words landed with surgical precision. He looked down at his son's crooked alphabet sheet and felt with sudden ferocity the memory of the boy's small body rigid in fever and Elizabeth's voice in the storm account repeated by innkeeper and physician alike. "Breathe for me. We go first." He had spent years going nowhere first, nowhere at all, mistaking stasis for safety. "She asked me for honest courtship once," he said, before he could stop himself. Beatrice's brows rose. "Did she? I offered money. She asked for work. I offered protection. She asked for contract. I have not known what to do with a person who refuses every easy arrangement." Beatrice stood and crossed to him, laying one hand briefly on his shoulder as she had when they were children, and their father shouted. "Then do the difficult arrangement," she said. "Stand where she can see you, not over her, and stop punishing yourself for still being capable of attachment. Anne is dead, Gabriel. You are not." After she left, he sat a long time without moving. Then he drew a clean sheet toward him and wrote, in his own hand, a declaration for Thursday. That Miss Elizabeth Larsen served by written contract, that any insinuation against her character was false to his knowledge, that he would swear to the provenance of Mr. Larsen's letter and attend personally when she spoke. He sanded the page, sealed it, and for once did not lock it away. By Wednesday evening, London knew blood was in the water. Invitations to Lady Harbury's musicale, already coveted, became political instruments. 2 gentlemen who had promised attendance sent regrets. One sent flowers instead, an unmistakable signal of private sympathy and public cowardice. A pamphlet appeared at 3 coffee houses by dusk, anonymous, crudely printed, viciously specific, describing a storm-born adventuress in language too informed to be random. Mrs. Grant burned the copy before the nursery maid could read it. At 9 o'clock, as Elizabeth and Fenwick reviewed order of documents in the morning room, the butler entered with a face she had come to recognise as bad news, wearing gloves. "Bow Street officer to see his lordship, sir. Says immediate." Ravenshield took the packet at the hall table and read under the lamp. Colour drained, then returned in hard lines. "What is it?" Elizabeth asked. He handed her the top page. A magistrate's summons, returnable at 10 the next morning, precisely 1 hour before Lady Harbury's first guests were due. Complainants: Mr. Elias Pritchard and Lady Larson. Charges: unlawful possession of private financial instruments, attempted extortion through threat of public defamation, and procurement of confidential documents under false employment. At the bottom, in smaller script, a note from the clerk. Failure to appear may result in warrant and immediate detention pending review. If she went to Bow Street, she would miss the musicale window where witnesses would be gathered and rumour at peak. If she skipped Bow Street, she risked arrest before she ever reached Harbury House. Either path could silence her before she spoke a word. Fenwick swore softly. Mrs. Grant, just behind him, made the sign of the cross before remembering where she was. Elizabeth read the summons again, slower this time, as if a hidden line might appear on second inspection. None did. Lady Larson had not merely threatened scandal. She had built a forked trap with law on one side and reputation on the other. Ravenshield reached for the bell, then stopped, thinking faster than sound. "Toland can move for adjournment at opening hour," he said. "If we secure even 2 hours..." "Adjournment can be denied," Fenwick said. "Yes." Elizabeth folded the summons once and set it on the table beside her father's letter. Outside, wind rose along the square, rattling the panes with the first hint of another storm. "Then tomorrow," she said, voice steady by force, "we choose where to stand and how quickly to run." No one answered, because no one in that room could yet see a path that did not cost blood. No one answered, because no one in that room could yet see a path that did not cost blood. Elizabeth did. "Wake, Mr. Toland," she said, "and send a note to Lady Harbury before dawn." Ravenshield turned toward her. "What note?" "That the musicale is now also the most efficient place in London for men who care about account fraud to spend their afternoon." Fenwick gave a startled half laugh. "Subtle?" "I'm done with subtle." She looked down at the summons. "They chose 10 o'clock because they think I will either hide or be hauled away. I will appear first, answer directly, and ask the magistrate to witness what follows at Harbury House. If he refuses, we proceed anyway. If he agrees, she cannot call it private slander." Ravenshield watched her for a long second, then rang for the butler. "Ink," he said, "and the fast courier." Bow Street smelled of damp wool, old paper, and impatience. By 9:40, the corridor outside the hearing room was thick with clerks, constables, complainants, and curious men who treated legal ruin as morning entertainment. Elizabeth stood between Fenwick and Mr. Toland in plain grey walking dress, gloves buttoned to the wrist, satchel in hand. Ravenshield stood a pace behind her, silent and unmistakable in dark coat and title. Across the passage, Lady Larson arrived in morning purple silk, perfectly veiled, Mr. Pritchard at her elbow, and a narrow-faced solicitor Elizabeth did not know, carrying 2 leather folios. Lady Larson's eyes found Elizabeth and sharpened with satisfaction. "You came," she murmured when they were near enough. "How obedient, after all." "I came to speak under oath," Elizabeth said. "You should try it," Pritchard snorted. "Enjoy the performance while it lasts." At 10 exactly, they were called in. Magistrate Baines was a square, tired man with good boots and no patience for ornament. He scanned the complaint, then the room. "Miss Larson, you are accused of unlawful possession of financial instruments and extortionary threat. "How do you answer?" Elizabeth stepped forward before Tolland could. "By producing the instruments, sir, and asking that chain of custody be examined in public." The solicitor for Pritchard rose. "My client objects. This is a narrow matter of theft and character." "It is a narrow matter," Elizabeth said, turning to the bench, "of whether forged debt was used to force my marriage. If that is character, then yes, mine and theirs." Murmurs broke out. Baines rapped once for silence. "Do you have counsel, Miss Larson?" "Yes, sir, but I ask leave to speak for the documents themselves." She opened her satchel and laid out packets in ordered stacks, copied ledgers from Fenwick's office, returned gift bill from Bond Street, Pritchard's threats, and her father's letter from military correspondence. "These were not stolen from my household. They were found among estate account bundles in Lord Ravenshield's lawful archives, and copied in the steward's office under supervision." Baines looked at Fenwick. "You swear that?" "I do," Tolland added, "and I have affidavit prepared, sir." The opposing solicitor pivoted quickly. "Even if so, they are irrelevant to the criminal complaint before you. My clients seek protection from a vindictive dependent." Lady Larson rose without waiting permission, voice trembling with crafted grief. "She was always unstable after her father's death. We sheltered her. She repays us with filth in society papers, an improper attachment to—" "Sit down, madam," said Baines flatly. She sat. Elizabeth kept her voice level. "Sir, by noon today Lady Larson intends to announce my engagement to Mr. Pritchard at Lady Harbury's music-hall. It is false. She has used that falsehood repeatedly to coerce me. If you confine this to 1 hour and one charge, she will claim legal vindication and seal the lie before witnesses." Baines narrowed his eyes. "You're asking what, exactly?" "A brief adjournment of this complaint to tomorrow, and your presence, or your clerk's, at Harbury House this afternoon, where the same allegations will be made publicly. I will present the accounts there before those named in the instruments. If I fail, you may issue warrant by supper." Tolland stiffened at the audacity. Ravenshield did not move. Pritchard exploded. "Outrageous! She means to stage manage!" Elizabeth turned to him. "You sent me violets and a bill before ever speaking of affection. You sent legal threats before ever receiving a refusal. You call that courtship?" His face mottled. Baines leaned back, studying all of them with the expression of a man deciding where truth was least decorative. Finally, he spoke. "Mr. Pritchard, Lady Larson, your complaint is not dismissed. It is continued until tomorrow morning. I am assigning Clerk Reeve to attend Lady Harbury's gathering and take statement if allegations are renewed. If either party attempts to leave jurisdiction today, I'll interpret it as consciousness of guilt and act accordingly." He looked at Elizabeth. "Miss Larson, if this is theatrics, you will regret it." "Yes, sir," she said. "If it is truth, others will." Outside, in the cold brightness of late morning, Lady Larson hissed as they descended the steps. "You think a magistrate's clerk makes you untouchable?" "No," Elizabeth said, "only audible." Lady Harbury's drawing-rooms by early afternoon were full enough to heat the windows. Music stands waited near the pianoforte. Crystal gleamed. Perfume, damp wool, and anticipation mixed in the air. Everyone knew something would happen. Nobody admitted they had come for it. Elizabeth stood near the back wall with Fenwick, Tolland, and a plain man in clerk's coat whom nobody recognised as Bow Street, unless they looked closely. Ravenshield remained deliberately apart, speaking to 2 MPs by the mantel, as if this were any other social call. His son was safely at home with Beatrice and Mrs. Grant. At 2:30, Lady Larson made her move. She rose near the instrument, tapped a spoon to glass, and smiled with maternal radiance sharpened to a blade. Before Miss Everleigh favours us with Schubert, permit a domestic happiness. My dear stepdaughter, Miss Elizabeth Larson, after some youthful misunderstanding, has at last accepted the honourable hand of Mr. Elias Pritchard. A rustle of surprise, then speculative silence. Elizabeth stepped forward into the centre of the room. "No, madam." The two words carried farther than she expected. Heads turned. Lady Harbury, frozen beside her tea-table, looked ready to faint or applaud. Elizabeth curtsied to the room, not to Lady Larson. "I request, before any bans are spoken in my name, that the gentlemen present here a matter of forged accounts tied to my late father's estate." Pritchard barked a laugh. "There! Blackmail in public as promised!" She faced him. "If truth is blackmail to you, that is not my arithmetic." He advanced a step. Ravenshield moved one pace from the mantel, not between them yet, but close enough to warn. Elizabeth opened her satchel on a side table and began laying documents out in sequence. Item 1. Debt schedule dated June 4 years past, listing emergency repairs of £200. She held up the page. Item 2. The same repairs charged again in August under livestock losses. Same amount, different heading, both in Lady Larson's hand. Item 3. Receipt to Mr. Pritchard for bridge financing in July, 1 month between both entries. We have, therefore, one expense paid 3 times. A low murmur rose. Lady Larson recovered, smiling tightly. "My poor child mistakes household management for fraud." Elizabeth did not blink. "Then let us continue. Here. Interest calculated at 9%, then copied at 14 with no new principal. Here, my portion listed as collateral despite trust clause forbidding encumbrance before my marriage with my consent. Here, Mr. Hale's office notation altered in different ink." Pritchard snapped. "Stolen! Fabricated by that Earl's servants!" From the doorway, Clark Reeve cleared his throat and held up his notebook. "Bow Street is taking names of all who make sworn claims today." That landed like dropped iron. Lady Larson changed attack. "Even if figures err, they are family concerns. You parade them because you have traded roadside heroics for a coronet. Tell them, Elizabeth, tell them what price bought your place in Ravenshield House." The room went still enough to hear rain begin at the windows. Elizabeth lifted her chin. "I asked no man to buy me. I asked men to read." Then she held up the last sheet. Her father's letter, seal broken by time, hand unmistakable. "My father writes here to Lord Ravenshield 6 months before his death, refusing a private loan because his daughter's trust already secures her future beyond marital debt. His words, his hand, predating every instrument Lady Larson now claims." She passed it first to Lady Harbury's husband, a barrister with tired eyes. He read, paled slightly, and passed it on. Across the room, Mr. Hale, summoned by Tolland and arriving late, damp and miserable, was recognised, cornered, and asked outright whether the hand was Mr. Larson's. Trapped by witnesses and Clark, he swallowed and said, "Yes, it is." Lady Larson's composure cracked for the first time. "You weak, disloyal little fool," she spat. Not at Hale, but at Elizabeth. "After all I spent to keep that roof above you—" "You spent my roof," Elizabeth said quietly. It still did not end. Pritchard lunged for the papers, knocking one crystal glass to the carpet, where it shattered. "This is a conspiracy," he shouted. "She promised me marriage. I have letters." He snatched a packet from his solicitor's folio and flung pages onto the table triumphantly. "There! Her hand!" Elizabeth looked once and almost laughed from sheer disbelief. The letters were clumsy imitations of her script, full of blotted loops she never made, diction she would never use. "My dearest sir, your devoted little E." She took one between finger and thumb. "You forged sentiment as badly as you forged numbers." Liar! Oh, then spell my middle name from memory, Mr. Pritchard. He opened his mouth, closed it. She turned the page toward the room. Ink too fresh for dates claimed. Paper watermark from a mill that opened last year. And this seal, she pointed, copied from Lady Larson's writing desk, not mine. My wax stamp bears my father's crest, a fox and star. This is a sheaf of wheat. The barrister by the fire nodded involuntarily. Correct. Pritchard wheeled toward his own solicitor. Say something. The man said nothing at all. Lady Larson stepped forward, face white with fury. Enough! Elizabeth, come here! Now, you will not destroy us over bookkeeping. No, Elizabeth said. Over theft. Lady Larson lowered her voice to a snake's whisper, audible only to those nearest. If I fall, I drag you with me. I will swear you shared in every entry. Elizabeth answered at normal volume so the room heard. Swear what you please. I will swear dates. She began reciting from memory, each figure crisp. March 12th, annuity transfer £70 entered twice. April 2nd, veterinary fee 28 entered against roof slate. July 19th, medical urgency 110 during a month with no physician call except servant chilblains. Shall I continue? She did. For 7 full minutes she did, while gossiping dowagers turned into silent auditors and 3 gentlemen fetched spectacles. When she finished, Tolland requested leave to present Kettering and Vale's copy register, obtained that morning by subpoena from Bow Street after Baines's continuation order. It showed Lady Larson had demanded removal of originals 1 day before Elizabeth's appointment, with a side note in Clark's hand. Client requests backdating of transfer letter. Declined. That note broke the last defence. Lady Larson stared at it, then at the clerk from Kettering, young, sweating, but present under summons, and all performance drained from her face, leaving something older and harder. You little men, she said to the room. You fatten on widows and call it law. Clerk Reeves stepped forward at last, with 2 constables from the hall. Lady Larson, Mr. Pritchard, by direction of Magistrate Baines, you are required to attend Bow Street immediately on suspicion of fraud, fabrication of instruments, and malicious complaint. Pritchard blustered, then saw no one would shield him and sagged into ugly pleading. This can be settled privately, my lord, he said toward Ravenshield. Name terms. Ravenshield's voice was ice. You mistook me for a buyer. Lady Larson did not plead. She looked at Elizabeth with naked hatred. You think this makes you free, she said, as the constable took her arm. A woman is never free. She is merely transferred. Elizabeth met her gaze. Not this one. They were led out through a corridor of parted silk and stunned silence. Pritchard protesting, Lady Larson rigid as carved stone until the front doors closed and the sound of carriage wheels swallowed them. For a moment nobody moved. Then Lady Harbury sat down very abruptly and said, Well, I suppose we shall postpone Schubert. A few people laughed shakily. Others began speaking all at once. Clerk Reeve requested signed statements. Tolland started collecting affidavits with ruthless cheer. The room became bureaucracy and aftermath. Elizabeth stood very still beside the paper-strewn table, hands suddenly cold. Ravenshield crossed to her at last. In the hush at the centre of noise he said, Not as challenge now, but as memory. You carried my son through a storm. What do you want in return? She looked at him, rain dimpling the windows behind his shoulder. My freedom first, my lord, she said. Then if you offer it freely, your honest courtship. He bowed his head once, like a man taking oath. You have both. By dusk the city had changed shape, not in stone or street, but in the way doors opened when Elizabeth's name was spoken. Some opened to curiosity, some to sympathy, some to sudden respect from people who had dismissed her as decorative collateral. Bow Street took statements until candlelight. By midnight, Pritchard was held. Lady Larson released to lodgings under bond pending indictment. 2 newspapers sent messengers before breakfast. The next morning in Chancery smelled of wet cloaks and sealing wax. The courtroom was colder than Lady Harbury's gilt rooms, less theatrical and far more dangerous. Elizabeth sat beside Tolland with Fenwick behind, and Ravenshield in the row reserved for interested parties, expression unreadable, presence absolute. When called, she stood and gave her name in a voice that did not tremble. Counsel for Lady Larson tried one last tactic. "Miss Larson, did you or did you not reside in Lord Ravenshield's house while unmarried?" "I did," she said, "under his protection. Under written employment at wages, entered here." She handed up the contract, signatures and dates clean. "Did your affection for the child influence your accusations against your stepmother?" "My affection for arithmetic did." A suppressed snort from the back bench. Even the clerk's mouth twitched. By noon, the Chancellor's interim order was entered. Freeze on disputed assets, suspension of Lady Larson's control over Elizabeth's portion, appointment of independent trustee pending full accounting. Not final victory, but a gate unlocked. Outside, under a leaden sky, Elizabeth exhaled for what felt like the first time in days. Beatrice was waiting in her carriage, black veil pinned back, eyes bright with fierce approval. "Come away with me for a while," she said without preface. "Not as exile, as choice. I need a companion with a spine. You need a roof with no ambushes." Elizabeth glanced toward Ravenshield. He had heard. He did not interrupt. "I would come," she said slowly, "if my wages and legal correspondence remain mine to direct." Beatrice grinned. "Excellent. You negotiate before climbing in. We shall get on." Ravenshield stepped closer once the footman moved out of earshot. "You owe me nothing," he said quietly, "including nearness. If distance gives this clean edges, take it." She studied his face, the exhaustion, the restraint, the unmistakable effort not to ask for more than she had offered. "Distance," she said, "is useful only when people use it honestly." He gave the ghost of a smile. "Then I shall write honestly." As the carriage pulled away, she looked back once and saw him in the courtyard, hat in hand in the drizzle, not calling her back. For the first time in years, leaving did not feel like being sent away. Beatrice's house in Richmond overlooked a curve of river and a lawn that surrendered to mud at the first serious rain. It was smaller than Ravenshield House, warmer by 10 degrees, and run on practical kindness rather than fear. 3 months later, on an afternoon of weak autumn sun, Elizabeth sat in the morning room with account books open, and Beatrice's spaniel under her chair. From the window she could see Ravenshield's carriage turn in at the gate with maddening punctuality. "Compose your face," Beatrice said, not looking up from her embroidery. "At present you resemble a general awaiting artillery." "I am awaiting your brother." "Precisely." He came in carrying his hat and a thin parcel wrapped in blue paper. His son, cheeks now fully restored, energy expanded to compensate, burst past him, straight to Elizabeth. "I beat Papa at Latin nouns," the boy announced. "He says victory was tactical." "He says no such thing," Ravenshield muttered. Then, seeing her expression, amended, "He says several false things daily." Tea dissolved some of the strain. Beatrice tactfully developed a sudden need to inspect preserves with the child and vanished, taking the dog and half the noise with her. Silence settled, companionable and charged. Ravenshield set the blue parcel on the table between them. "For you." Inside lay a slim volume of Virgil, margins clean except one page where a note in his hand read, "For storms and steering." Elizabeth traced the ink with one fingertip. Thank you. He stood by the fireplace, then sat, then stood again, visibly abandoning his usual choreography. I do not know how to court without strategy, he said at last. I have made a career of strategy, but strategy with you has mostly consisted of being corrected. She laughed softly. You dislike correction. I dislike failing at prevention. I failed my wife. I nearly failed my son. I would rather be shot than fail you by presuming. She set the book down. Gabriel! It was the first time she had used his name. He stilled. You did not fail your wife by not defeating death, she said. You failed yourself by deciding grief was a permanent rank you must wear. I cannot marry rank. I can only marry a man. He looked at her as if the room had tilted. I love you, he said, rough and direct and without title. Not as debt, not as gratitude, not because you saved my child, though you did. I love the way you refuse easy lies. I love that you read every line before signing. I love that my son sleeps when you promise morning. I love you enough to hear no, if no is what you need. The words struck through her defences with almost physical force. She took a breath, then another. I needed freedom to prove I was not choosing safety disguised as affection, she said. These months, I have been poor no longer, employed by choice, consulted, not commanded. I have watched you come every week, whether rain or gossip or Parliament called you elsewhere. I have read your letters. You are less cold on paper. Damning praise. It is praise. He reached into his coat and drew out a folded document, setting it beside the Virgil. This is a proposed marriage settlement. Your trustees reviewed it. Beatrice amended 2 clauses and insulted my intelligence twice. Only twice, came Beatrice's voice from the doorway. I was unwell. She retreated again, before either could throw a cushion. Elizabeth opened the settlement and read in full, lips moving slightly over legal terms. Separate property preserved, her school fund protected, joint guardianship language explicit for future children, widows' rights fair, no hidden hooks. No. She turned to the final page and found a blank line waiting for her signature when and if she chose. She looked up. This is honest, she said. I am trying to be. She held his gaze. Then, yes, on one condition. Name it. When we marry, we open the estate school by Michaelmas, in my father's name, for girls with quick minds and empty purses. His answer was immediate. Done. She smiled then, fully, and stood. He crossed the small distance as if approaching something fragile and fierce at once. When he kissed her, it was not storm or rescue or transaction. It was deliberate, warm, and a little unsteady with relief. From the hall his son shouted, "Does this mean she is coming home?" Elizabeth pulled back just enough to call, "Only if you continue tactical nouns." A triumphant whoop followed. Autumn rain came fine and silver on their wedding morning, not a tempest but a steady blessing that darkened the church steps and made everyone smell faintly of wet wool and roses. Elizabeth signed the register with a hand that paused only once over the legal line she had read the night before, twice by candlelight. Ravenshield signed beside her. Beatrice dabbed her eyes and denied it fiercely. Afterward, at Ravenshield House, the old nursery was no longer battlefield, but chaos of ribbon, cake crumbs, and a 6-year-old page who had forgotten his role and decided to guard the sugared almonds. "Do I call you Mamma now?" he asked Elizabeth with grave courtesy when adults were briefly distracted. "You may call me Elizabeth when angry, Mamma when sleepy, and impossible when you lose at chess," she said. He considered this. "Reasonable." By winter, Chancery's final decree arrived by special messenger during breakfast. Fenwick read the formal language aloud, full accounting upheld, fraudulent instruments voided, Elizabeth's portion restored with arrears, Lady Larson permanently removed from control and ordered to pay costs from remaining personal holdings. Pritchard, convicted on separate fraud counts, was sent to debtor's prison pending further sentence. Lady Larson departed London for Bath under social quarantine, so complete it was almost legal punishment. Elizabeth listened, then buttered her toast and said, "Please send Mr. Hale a copy of the decree with my compliments, and a recommendation that he rediscover his spine." Fenwick coughed into his napkin. Michaelmas came bright and windy. On the edge of Ravensshield's Hampshire estate, in a converted stone granary that smelled of lime wash and new slate, Elizabeth stood before 12 girls and one terrified young mistress at the opening of Larson School. The girls sat with backs too straight in borrowed pinafores, eyes bright with suspicion and hunger, for bread, for books, for both. One, freckled and narrow as a sapling, clutched her slate like contraband. Elizabeth set a ledger and a Latin primer on the front table. "You will learn letters," she said. "You will learn figures. You will learn how to read any paper put before you sign your name, especially then—" A hand went up at once, the freckled one. "Even if it's from a lord, ma'am," Elizabeth smiled, "particularly if it's from a lord." Laughter, startled and delighted, loosened the room. At noon, rain began again, drumming the slate roof. She stepped to the doorway and watched it sheet across the yard, where the stable boys ran for cover. Behind her, girls sounded out verbs. Ahead, mud deepened in familiar ruts. The weather smelled exactly like that night years ago when she had staggered into another stable, bloodied and nameless to everyone who mattered. Now boots splashed behind her. Ravenshield came up, carrying 2 cloaks, their son at his side and a basket of meat pies in his hands. "You are needed inside," he said. "Apparently the Romans are revolting." "They did that frequently," Elizabeth replied. The boy grinned up at her. "Tell the storm story tonight." She glanced from his eager face to her husband's, to the schoolroom where girls bent over numbers that might one day save them. "Yes," she said, taking the basket, "but we tell it properly." "Which way is proper?" he asked. She looked out at the rain, then back at the lighted room. "Not as the night a lord was owed," she said. "As the night a woman chose her own life, and this time when thunder rolled far off across the downs, no one told her to lower her eyes."